the ideas that I'll be using a lot tonight is this book here by Gil Bailey. So just to let you know, so we've got a little bit of philosophy. We're going to be introduced to a little bit of theology tonight. Okay, so a little bit of stuff about theos, about God, because you can't really talk about culture without bringing that poor sorry bugger into the dialogue. Because remember, for the people who were here last week, that the purpose of all cultures is to ask three questions. Where am I from? Which is the origin of things. The second is, how do I live my life? Which is the existential question of what is the purpose of living. And the third question of all cultures is what happens when we die? Or what is the meaning of death? So these three questions are in any culture, and if you fly into anywhere in the world, if it's got a culture that's reasonably intact, those three questions will still be quite pervasive. Is that okay? And they will be dealing with them in some certain way. And the West has its own dreaming around them, and so we'll be talking around those three questions. So I'll be using Gil Bailey's work along with Rene Girard tonight. And essentially what we're going to be talking about tonight is desire and imitation. How about that? Does that excite you? Because subjectivity is about where you put your desire. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with a question for all of you. Is that all right? And but there's no pressure, because I've asked this question to lots of different groups, well, not in the hundreds, but at least in the 20, 50, 60 groups, and no one's got it wrong. So there's no pressure. Okay? So here's the question. There's a room, and in it is a whole bunch of toys. And a little child walks into the room, and he grabs the first one that he sees. And it happens to be a red fire truck. And he's playing with it. Happily, because it's just the one in front of him. Now here's the question. 10 minutes later, a second child walks into the room. You ready for the question? Which toy does the second child desire? Yes, sir.
The red fire truck, because the other guy's got it.
Thank you very much. So this is the very basis of Rene Girard's work. And it's actually what he says is the very source and origin. We're talking about the origin of stuff, of violence. It's a bit odd, isn't it? How would that be so? Well, Girard is saying that we're imitative creatures, right? So we're mimetic. Not memes in the Dawkinian sense, but mimetic in the Girardian sense. Now, Girard is known as the kind of the social Darwin of France. He won one of the big gold medals in science for it, because it's a universal fact, it seems, that all cultures and all human beings are imitative. So this is kind of important for the lecture, because what you do with your desire and where you put it is virtually the very essence of spirituality. All cultures look at what you do with desire. And let me give you two examples, because we're going to talk about Augustine and desire and Rousseau and desire. But I'll talk through just very briefly in lovely broad brushstrokes, like I always do when it comes to these sort of lectures, is the two kind of responses to desire in two different cultures. And let's start with this fella here, Buddha. Okay, so Buddha talks about what do you do with desire, and his proclamation is to extinguish it, which is called nirvana. So nirvana is I think the literal interpretation is to blow out a candle. So it's that the very light of the flame of desire is extinguished. So the whole cosmology of Buddhism is the non-self and the idea that desire is extinguished, gotten rid of. A lot of people in the West are moving there, and I will talk about that in the third lecture on one of the flights from our dreaming, which is towards that extinguishment. Okay? Now the second kind of desire is the Christological one, which is the one that the West comes from, and I'll be talking about that. And that's not the extinguishment of desire, but the right alignment of desire, called caritas or love. So one doesn't get rid of desire, one aligns it appropriately or in the right way. So it's not a extinguishment, but a alignment. And it's directed towards a thing called God, which has got such a dirty name because of its appropriation and its kind of use for things other than the transcendent, that to even speak that kind of word, unless you're an evangelical fundamentalist, which I'm not, is that it's a word that's more offensive than using virtually any other word in a lecture. You could use the market, you can use, but to use the word God actually bristles Western people. And there's a reason for it, and that's partly due to this lecture, not completely. So there are two fundamental subjectivities that we're going to talk about tonight. And the question is really about, where is your subjectivity? What are you subject to? How do you subject your desire? So the desire can be either extinguished, aligned, or proclaimed. So one is aligned and one's proclaimed, which is mine, and this is Rousseau. And the question I'm wanting to ask sometime tonight about our Western dreaming is, are we willing to be subject other than something than our own subjectivity? Can you see the challenge there? Because I'm arguing as an organisational psychologist, it may be necessary for collective action. Is that okay? That is not because it's nice, but it might be needed. Because the implications of radical subjectivity may lead to what I think is where we're heading, which is increasing dispersal of the Western person into myriads of different ways of being, to a point where you get a whole bunch of people from the West in the room and you've got such diversity of opinion that it's just hard to get them together, to get it together. So freedom is where our subjectivity lies, with our own notion of freedom. Did anybody watch Two Men in China last night? You watch it? Did you know what the show's about? John Doyle and Tim Flannery? And they go over to China, and John Doyle's summing up the whole series. And he says something really interesting about China, because he's exhausted, he's overwhelmed by the scale of it, he says. And he says, look, and this is John Doyle, not Tim Flannery. And he says there's two things that seem quite evident to him in China at the moment. He said I don't think he used the word worship, but the desire for money and the desire for me.
Yep.
Remember that?
Yep.
I found that really fascinating, because my feeling is that while that might be inherent in every culture, it certainly seems to be a pretty good Western export. Prada, because he shows you all the malls where people are buying stuff, money and me. Now here's the point, and we're going to go through this. That is not a fact, it's a construction, but we act as though it is. And there's a reason, because a myth isn't something that's unreal. Stay with me. A myth, from Hillman's point, is what is really real, what we're actually willing to die for. Our stories constitute who we are. If you don't believe me, go and confront a certain myth within a certain personal culture and you'll get kicked back. So a myth is not, when you go to a scientific forum saying the myth of smoking, that's a lie. A myth of smoking is like the myth of the hero individual. That's the myth of smoking. Do you understand? Somebody will be willing to die for the myth of smoking. That's a myth. The fact that it kills you is a biological or scientific fact, but it's not a non-truth. That's why I got pretty shitty with scientists appropriating the word myth as a non-lie. They're not looking at it properly. You ready for Augustine? Augustine was kicking around the 5th century in a place called Hippo in I've only got 3 slides, so it's okay. Augustine basically lived in an era not unlike our own in a certain way, because the Roman Empire was crumbling. So the very certainties of which the way that their culture was actually operating in was now crumbling. The gods were dying. They were no longer holding the community together. So he's born into this kind of uncertainty around the Western imagination of the Greco-Roman stuff. Now, thrusted into that kind of situation, he's exposed to the early emergence of a thing called Christianity, which actually is a Eastern or Middle Eastern or Near Eastern religion. It's not Western, right? So the prototype of Christianity happened in Egypt and Syria in particular. And the first experiments into Christianity were in what they call the patristic era of the fathers and the desert mothers. So a whole bunch of people said, to hell with this way of life, and buggered off into the desert, not unlike places of Buddhism, and did some stupid things like, what am I when I take myself away from this? Is that okay? It's a pretty serious question, of which a whole bunch of stuff comes from, which I won't go into, which we could later, depending. Now, he writes a number of famous treatises, of which one of them, well, let's say Augustine, I'm not a theologian, but what we can say about Augustine is he has this an amazing, profound impact on the way that Western people operate and move in the world. I mean, and still has today. I mean, the way that we operate has an Augustinian flavour to us. Despite our denial, Augustus is everywhere in us. And one of them is actually around our subjectivity, which includes his kind of his musings on original sin. You've probably heard about all of that carry on. Well, we're back to this idea of origin. So he's trying to find out the origin of things, but in a mythopoetic way. So he starts to reread or midrash or retells the Hebrew story of the origin of human beings. But he also writes two other books, of which one of them is the Confessions, which we're going to talk about, and the other one's the City of God. So he looks at the idea of how do you bring the kingdom into the earth. So he's looking at an incarnational reality, because Christianity has this terrible burden. And the burden of Christianity is how do you actually make it enfleshed, because it's a enfleshed theology. It's not up here. We made it up here, but it's not. It's a God becoming man. And so he's having to bring the two metaphysics together. It's the response of Christianity. And it plays buggery in the Western psyche, frankly, because it requires action, not just devotion. So here he is, and he's had a pretty profligate life. But like Rousseau, he starts to look for a place to stand, right? You remember I was saying in the first lecture that who was the Greek guy? It'll come to me. Archimedes. Find a place firm to stand and I can move the world. So the fulcrum of any movement in the world has to stand on firm ground. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. If you do psychotherapy, what people are looking for is firm ground. Terra firma within the inner life necessary to move. Okay? Or communities or whatever. So a firm ground. So he's looking for one in the midst of all of this tumult, very much like where we're living now. But he doesn't look towards the church, which you think he might. That comes a lot later. And he doesn't look towards the Roman Empire, which surrounds him. He does something quite radically different. He goes inwards. So this guy goes into the inner journey and professes the first really kind of subjectivity in the West about the inner life, of which you guys, whether you like it or not, including me, are inheritors of. I think it's great. I'm glad I come from this culture, this Occidental culture of the self. But he goes inwards, but he asks fundamentally different kinds of questions of subjectivity. So he's in a kind of pretty bad way. And so he hears and looks and sees around him this profession of subjectivity in relation to this strange Christian God, which is prototypical. It's starting to form its practices, but it's still very much in its early stages. Now, in the Christian tradition, there's a thing called imitato Christi, which means the imitation of Christ. So in the mystical tradition of the West, remember we were talking about subjectivity, imitation and desire? So that where does he put his subjectivity? He puts his subjectivity into the imitation of Christ, the imitatio Christi. And why he does that is because he's trying to find a place to stand, or in his instance, a place to rest, a place for his being to be. Is that okay? Stay with this because we'll get to Rousseau, because he's much more fun for Western people. But he looks at midrashing or reinvestigating the Christian story that the origin of a person is founded in the mystery of God, him or herself, which is actually essentially good. So the Hebrewic notion of being is that you're created in the image and likeness of God. Is that okay? You've probably heard it somewhere, but what does it mean? It means that your constitution, where you're subject to, is actually into mystery itself. You with me on that? Because it's really important. Now, if you're subject to mystery, then it doesn't need a full and utter account of the self. You don't have to explain everything about who you are. Freedom for that kind of subjectivity is that we come from mystery and so are constituted and subject to mystery. That means I don't need self-justification. Or what Paul says is a way out of this bloody problem is that I'm hidden in Christ. I'm hidden in mystery. Now, why is that freeing? Can I give you a practical example? You're probably wondering where the hell is this going. I was working with this one guy and he wanted to do some work with me, and he was a coach, psychotherapist, guru kind of guy. Right? And I found him very troubling, and something in me kind of was really upsetting. And he would say something like, I really need to get to know you. I need to know who you are. Where do you, what are you like? And all that, moving inside the psyche, right? And I felt kind of violated into that exploration of who I was, because I wasn't able to justify myself. Is that okay so far? I couldn't explain myself. But I remember reading Thomas Merton, who's a mystic of the Christian inheritance, and he says that I don't need justification, I'm hidden in the mystery of Christ. I thought, that's my way out. That's my freedom. I don't need justification to this man because he's just like me. He ain't God. So as a psychologist, that's a little embarrassing because you need to know yourself as a psychologist, you know that. But the problem is, of course, is that if you're actually constituted in mystery, which is God, then self-knowledge can't be fully known. That comes later, comes a lot later, and it comes as a retort of this kind of confession. Final conclusion that Augustine makes, and he goes on a merry journey, of course. One of his great statements is he says, God, let's paraphrase his mystery, I want you now but not quite yet. So he's got some grapple that his being is constituted in the transcendent. He's got some feeling of it, some experience, but the other parts of himself still wants to make whoopee. The desires in him are all over the place. Is this all making sense to you? I'm sure that this must be universal in the Western dreaming. So my desire is directed towards the transcendent, but it's directed everywhere else. Paul says the same thing in his solution. He says, he gets to his point in his epistles, and he says, I try and do the things that I want to do, but I can't do them. What saves me from this dilemma, right? The human condition. I want to direct my desire, because he's not a Buddhist. I want to direct it to the transcendent God, but it's all over the place. He comes and solves it by a thing called grace and mercy, right? That's his way out of the problem. Well, Augustine aligns himself with that way out. So he says, you've made us for yourself. So the first classic statement is that the origin of who I am is actually constituted in mystery itself. Now, can you see how this is starting to offend us already? It does offend a lot of Western people, and I'll get to that. And our hearts are restless. Now, he doesn't talk about his mind. Have you noticed that? Do you know why? Because this is prior to Cartesian dualism. The mind and the body hasn't been split yet by Descartes. That comes around about the same time as Rousseau. And that causes a whole lot of buggery. But we won't go into that. We'll go into a little bit of it. But heartfulness is a constitution in those days. In here, the mind of the heart mattered, which was about intention. So, Hebrewic ways of being, you know, when I was talking about that fella at the beginning, Abraham, but see, we're still trying to resolve this part of the dreaming, is that he's not concerned about what's in your head, or he's concerned about your intention, the moral life, right? The intention of the heart. But if the desires are miscorrected, they go all over the place. And so he says that we only rest in the ultimate desire of every human being, which is to rest into mystery itself. And he says that's the project, that's the invitation, and it gives birth to a very strong, very powerful form of Western dreaming called Christianity, which, if you go to the West in particular, you'll see it right through the art, pretty much right up until the Enlightenment. It's an obsession with the West on this idea of resting in thee. He doesn't say me. Is that okay? So the self is subject to the other, subject to this thing that's called God. Now, I'm not talking about the guy with the beard, by the way, you know, right? That's not the God I'm talking about, that's a thing. We're talking about transcendence, mystery, the thing that we can't hold on to. That the only place to rest in is in mystery itself, which has a whole bunch of other implications. So that's Augustine. He says in the end that all desires are seeking the ultimate subjectivity, which is to rest in the mystery of God itself, which Western people are still trying to do, but not in that one. It's fleeing a lot from it, and the churches are at a loss to know why. But I think this lecture has a pretty good crack on maybe one of the reasons, not all of them. And it might be something to do with this book, of which, anyone a psychologist or psychology or done psychology? Right, well, it all really comes back to Rousseau. Now, he writes a book in the 16th century, and it's called The Confessions. And in a way, it's one guy talking to another back 1,000 years. This is a clever guy, because he's not only talking to the big fella, Augustine, he's talking to his culture. He's talking to his Western people. But not only is he doing that, he's making another confession of which he's actually asking others to understand. And this is the opening line. He says, I've resolved on an enterprise which has no precedence, so it's new, and which once complete will have no imitator. See what's happening? My purpose is to display to my kind, my people, a portrait in every way true to nature, and the man I shall display is myself. Right? Simply myself, I know my own heart and understand my fellow man, but I'm made unlike any I've ever met. I will even venture to say that I'm like no one in the whole world. I may not be better, but at least I am different. What is born, folks, is the autonomous self, the individual. There's a couple of problems in it. It seems from Bailey and Gerard's work, and it's actually in the language that he writes. But before I go there, Gil Bailey is quite right, because it's still playing out. He says that confession is like catnip to the European imagination. I'm going to be me. No other but me. Can you see what's going on? But there's some things that Gil Bailey says belies some of this imitation. You know, we're back to the red fire truck. We're not interested in the thing, but the fact that somebody else is interested is the source of our imitation. Classic example is no one's wearing flares anymore. I hope not. Why aren't we wearing flares at the moment? Because they're not worthy of imitation. Are they? So what's my definition of leadership? Behaviours and values worthy of imitation. Why? Not because they're right or wrong, it's because we're mimetic creatures. We imitate each other. How we display who we are tells others who we believe we are. I agree with that axiomatic truth. Fashion does it beautifully, does it not? Because if you don't believe me, go into your wardrobe and pull out something 5 or 6 years ago, unless you're not worried about fashion. One of the first experiences will be one of embarrassment. But why? Did you see what I mean? It's only because it's not worthy of imitation anymore. You will not be seen in the approval of others. So he's going to display to his kind a portrait. Now here's the important bit. The ultimate goal is not to rest in mystery for Augustine. The ultimate goal is complete self-sufficiency. Me is the project.
Sorry, you said Augustine, do you mean
No, Rousseau, I'm sorry. Rousseau is basically saying, I'm the project. I'm it. It actually co-opts some of Descartes' notion of, I think, therefore I am. They are now undermining any subjectivity into mystery and to community, but just to me. Now, the problem with that, there's a lot of them, but one of the problems for mine is that it creates an enormous burden for a human being to cope with. But it also belies a certain kind of fakeness about it. How's that for a word? Because in order to be different, everybody started to imitate each other. Think about it. The ultimate movement in the Western dreaming ends up in Lady Gaga. It has to. Which is, I am so original, so completely me, this is what it looks like. But it cannot exist without the approval and the invitation of others. So it can't be constituted in a kind of self that emerges out of silence and mystery, but through the approval of others. And the burden of that is enormous, because I'm a psychologist. You think about it, Freud comes from here. Psychotherapy comes from here. Hillman's right, he said we're the only culture in the world that when you sit down with a problem, they're constituted to you and the first relative, your parents. If you went to Aboriginal cultures and you had a problem, the first concern is what you are in relation to your community or to the spirits. If you go to Asian cultures, particularly Chinese cultures, and you're out of sorts, something's wrong with you in relation to the community or to the spirits. Do you see what I'm saying about subjectivity, folks? I'm not trying to say it's right or wrong. I'm just trying to, as a diagnostician, explain what's going on. Is that when the only form of subjectivity is me, it has to take on a couple of things. One is, you're alone, you're responsible, and Freud comes along and just knocks us into a cocked hat and says, and by the way, it's shot through with pathology. It's not created in the image of God. It's created by two things, Thanatos and Eros. I'll try and paraphrase it. Either we'll kill it or have sex with it.
So what were those two things again?
Thanatos and Eros. We know about Eros because a lot of our culture's kind of immersed in both of them. The erotic charge, you know, all the kind of, right? That's very big in our culture. But also Thanatos is a very strong part of our culture as well, our dreaming. So all of those, smash 'em up games and the all of that comes from the very deep sense of our dreaming. That's Freud. But the problem you see, as I agree with Wittgenstein, is that Freud didn't interpret myths, he just created new ones. It's a bit unfortunate when you tell that to your colleagues about Narcissus. You know, the narcissistic person. Have you ever read Narcissus? It's not called that. Did you know that? Do you know what it's called? Echo and Narcissus. It's a story between two myths. Did you know that? The story is actually not about Narcissus at all. It's about two people and what happens when you gaze and ignore the other. My ending in psychiatry is when I actually said that the psychiatric gaze is the narcissistic gaze, and echo is the patient who's going even further and further distance through your narcissistic objectification. Bowed and walked out. That was the end of my career in psychiatry, because what I said is, well, if Freud can reinterpret the myths, so will I. Can you see what I'm saying, folks? Stories are up for grabs, but they're powerful. And if you retell them a new way of constitution and seeing the world matters. So what am I saying? Rousseau says he's alone in public, essentially. I'm myself, but I'm going to display it. The ultimate kind of imitation of unique individuality, it seems to me, is, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but fascinating. And not the one or two tattoos, but you know the people that just like really have got lots of tattoos on themselves. Because I don't know where to look, because I'm a bit old-fashioned, you see, because I was taught that it was indiscreet to look at people, right? But the problem is that they want me to look at them because I think it's the right thing to do because I've gone to a lot of effort putting stuff on them, right? But the problem is that I'm not sure whether I should or not. There's a look at me, don't look at me. Imitate but don't, because I'm an individual, but everybody's doing the same thing. Can you see the problem with that form of subjectivity? Now, the end of it, and I'll just sort of, is that it's incredibly seductive, the self-made man, is it not? Because what you need to display your subjectivity, your originality, is you have to do it through consumption, it seems to me at the moment, with increasing levels of individuality. Because the moment that somebody sort of kind of imitates it, it all becomes a bit old-fashioned and we're back to the races again. But does the self stand on terra firma? You know, the true self? And my argument is probably not. It's a certain kind of construction. James Hillman, I think, was right about psychotherapy. He wrote a book called 100 Years of Psychotherapy and the World's Getting Worse. And it's an interesting book because he just asked one simple question. He's a psychotherapist. Where's the transformation? I was thinking about this on the way here because I thought I better think of something to say. Where's the transformation? You've got this existential problem. Where am I from? What am I going to do with my life? And what do I do when I die, right? All the biggies. And you find yourself into a therapist chair. And the first question he asks is, so how did you get on with your mother? So it kind of lets everything off the hook apart from your sort of atomised relationships of just yourself and some other person. But not the whole thing around you. You're with me so far? And so he said in his book, you should get it, it's quite a laugh. It's not kind of laugh. But he said, you know, like everybody's kind of going to therapy. You know, and everyone's in therapy in America. You're not de rigueur if you're not actually in therapy, right? So the problem is, he said, look what's happening outside. You can't swim in the bloody ocean. It's a mess. You know, there's stuff everywhere, and it's dirty, and you know what I mean. And people are afraid to talk to individuals and all this sort of stuff. Where's the transformation? And his argument is, if the self is proclaimed as the only thing that's there, it's the only thing that needs fixing. Everything else can go to hell. So there's this kind of dreaming that we've got that's problematic, you know, going back to this big thing with the planet, is that, going back to, and I'll sort of finish it a little bit with this, it's going back to Two Men in China, you know, because there's Tim Flannery giving facts about the fact that the dolphin in the Yangtze River or the one near Shanghai is gone. And then all these other facts about evolution, about how these beautiful animals who have the right to exist have no longer there. And then John Doyle turns around and says, but you know what? Have a look at this. Right? So he shows Shanghai. And he says, and no one gives a bugger. And probably because we're exporting a sense of self, a constitution of look at me, which requires quite a lot of effort, does it not? Which leads to the final form of this conclusion, which is the curated self. You know what curating means? You know when you create an exhibition, exactly what you do on Facebook. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, because I do it too, but I'm aware of why I'm doing it. I hope. The curated self is not who I am. It's nowhere near who I am. It's the proclamation of who I am. I am not like any other. I may not know others but me, and look at me. It's Rousseau shot through, scaled up by how many billions of people. I think it's brilliant. But those two stories of constitution and subjectivity are important. freedom in terms of my own self-expression over the rights of others and the other, the divine and the transcendent, plays out its game. And we may need to look at those things as Western people in order to collectivise. Maybe not, and that's the dialogue we're going to have in about 15 minutes. So I'm saying we may not need it, because at the moment the experiment is simply we don't, and that's okay. But I'm not sure whether it's a terra firma. Two great myths stand against each other. Is the heroic myth of the exercise of the will, leadership, you know, all that training stuff that I have to do as an industrial psychologist. And it's mastery through effort, through the will. Nietzsche reigns supreme. If you wipe transcendence off the horizon, what replaces it is my will. You know, Rousseau's co-opted, and it's look at me. I'm the self-made man. And how are you self-made in the West? By really accumulating a lot of stuff. But it's a construction, I would contend. But it's really this heroic myth, and it plays out in all our dreaming. Our films are in it. Because a lot of American films are retested, you know that, don't you? And if they don't have a sort of mythos of triumph of the will, they have to be re-rendered. They can't sit in mystery. Anybody seen a Thomas Hallett film? The Tree of Life?
Mm-hmm.
Go watch it.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't triumph. It just asks deeper questions. If you want to see a great film that doesn't fit into the Western myth of triumph, go see it or watch it or something. Did anyone like it? I thought it was fabulous.
I love
Yeah. Then there's this other poor fellow, and these two myths is the exercise of willingness. This one of Rousseau and Augustine. And it's a mystery through consent. Buddhists do it differently by extinguishment. The Christians do it through the alignment of right desire. And those great stories still keep us up at night. How do we act and move in the world? I want the right thing, but not now. Because maybe I could be curating a better self. And that might take money and time and effort. It might be a construction, but it's worthy of display and imitation. And hence, the self is affirmed and born. But if the imitation is withdrawn and all of a sudden we're on to the next Lady Gaga, what happens to, what I forgot her original name is, again, Origin. What happens to the self when that happens? Do you see what I'm saying? Now, I'll just leave it with this as a question, because again, I don't have answers. Just try to explore things. As Western people, are we subject to something other than our own subjectivity? And do we need something other than our own subjectivity for collective action? We may not need it. I don't have an answer, but I certainly am interested in that question about, do we need to relinquish some of this self in order to be us or we? Or can we continue those proclamations of individual self and still get together to get it together? Because I think we have to get together to get it together, whatever the challenges are.